The sound that stays with me isn't the crash of wood. It's the steady, professional rhythm of men doing a job they were paid to do. I stood on the front lawn, keys still in my hand, watching a hired crew dismantle my veranda plank by plank. The railings came off first, then the posts. No shouting, no chaos, just efficiency. Neighbors slowed their cars. Someone across the street pretended to check their mailbox twice. Margaret Collins stood near the driveway, arms folded, calm as a homeowner supervising routine maintenance. She nodded once when she saw me, the way you acknowledge a late arrival to a meeting you already started without them. "You're home," she said. Not a question. I looked at the men. Hard hats, clipboard, a rented dumpster already half full. My veranda, the space I had designed, paid for, and used every morning, was reduced to stacked lumber in under an hour. "What's happening?" I asked. Margaret didn't hesitate. "I took care of a safety issue." She turned slightly toward the nearest neighbor, projecting her voice just enough. "The structure wasn't up to code. I couldn't risk someone getting hurt." It was said with concern, with authority, with the confidence of someone used to being believed. Evan stood a few steps behind her. My husband. His hands were in his pockets, his eyes stayed on the gravel. He didn't contradict her. He didn't look at me. If you've ever been publicly corrected by someone who claims to love you, you know the feeling. It's not anger first. It's disbelief, a quiet recalculation of reality. I walked closer to the crew. One of the men glanced at me, then back at his supervisor. "Who authorized this?" I asked him. He lifted the clipboard, polite but cautious. "Ma'am, we have a work order and permit." I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I leaned in and read. The permit was taped neatly to the board. City seal, expiration date, address my address. But the name listed wasn't mine. It wasn't Evan's either. It was Margaret's. That was the moment something shifted. Not outwardly. Inside. Margaret continued speaking, filling the silence. "I know this is upsetting, but sometimes adults have to make hard decisions. You'll thank me later." She said it like a conclusion, like the story was already finished. A neighbor asked, "Is everything okay?" Margaret smiled. "Of course. Just preventative work." I nodded once. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. Then I stepped back. There was no point explaining in front of strangers, no value in correcting her narrative on a lawn that no longer felt like mine. Power, I was learning, doesn't need volume. It needs timing. I took out my phone and started taking photos, wide shots, close-ups, the permit, the company logo on the truck, the timestamp visible on my lock screen. One of the workers paused. "Is that okay?" "It's my property," I said. Calm. Even. "I'm documenting." Margaret stiffened slightly. Just slightly. Evan finally spoke. "Maybe we should talk inside." "There is no inside right now," I said. That was true in more ways than one. I watched as the last beam was lowered. The veranda was gone. The men loaded the final debris and prepared to leave. Margaret thanked them. She always thanked people when she felt in control. As the truck pulled away, the street returned to normal. Cars passed, doors closed. The show was over. Margaret turned to me. "We'll discuss repairs later." I met her eyes. "No," I said. One word. Neutral. Final. She blinked. "Excuse me?" "I won't be discussing repairs," I repeated. "I'll be reviewing records." That was all. No accusation, no threat. Just a statement of process. She laughed softly, as if indulging a child. "You're overreacting." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked back to my car, sat inside, and scrolled through the photos I'd taken. The permit, the name, the date, the company ID number. Margaret thought she had solved a problem. What she had actually done was leave a paper trail. And paper, when handled correctly, doesn't forget. If this moment holds your attention, if you've ever stood still while someone quietly crossed a line, this is a story worth listening to. You're welcome to like the video and subscribe, simply so you don't miss what unfolds next. And if you're listening somewhere right now, leave a comment with your city. I read them. I notice where these stories travel. Now, let me take you back. Back to the version of my life that looked stable from the outside. Back to a time when I still believed silence was peace, and family decisions were made with care. Long before a quiet afternoon turned into a public undoing. For a long time, nothing about my life looked unusual. That's the part people miss when they hear what happened later. They imagine constant fights, obvious cruelty, warning signs flashing red. It wasn't like that. It was quieter, more orderly, almost reasonable. Evan and I had been married for 4 years. We lived in a modest house in a calm neighborhood, tree-lined streets, predictable weekends, neighbors who waved but didn't ask questions. On paper, we were stable. 2 incomes. No debt worth mentioning. A house deed with both our names printed clearly at the bottom. But stability can be cosmetic. Margaret entered our daily life early and never really left. She had helped with the down payment when we first bought the house. Not a loan, she insisted. A contribution. She said it proudly, often, and always in public. I just wanted to help them get started, she'd tell friends. Young couples need guidance. Guidance became presence. Presence became influence. She had opinions about how the kitchen should function, which contractors were trustworthy, which upgrades were smart, and which were indulgent. She never raised her voice. She never insulted me directly. She framed everything as concern, safety, efficiency, family values. If you objected, you looked emotional. Evan grew up inside that logic. He was kind, thoughtful, conflict avoidant. He believed peace came from accommodation. When Margaret spoke, he listened not because he agreed with everything, but because disagreement felt like disloyalty. I learned quickly that silence kept things smooth. At first, it felt temporary. A phase. I told myself this was what blending families looked like. I told myself maturity meant flexibility. I told myself love meant choosing battles carefully. Years passed that way. Margaret had a key to the house. She didn't abuse it, technically. She always announced herself. She just arrived often. Sometimes with groceries we hadn't asked for, sometimes with folders, printouts of articles about home maintenance, insurance liability, neighborhood standards. She liked documentation. When I proposed changes, I noticed how the room shifted. When I mentioned converting the veranda into a small studio, a quiet space for my work, Margaret smiled politely and said, "We'll see, not no. Just not now." Evan echoed that language. "Maybe later. Let's not rush." End quote. You have not taken 10 quote. Mom might have a point. There was always time. Just never permission. I kept records without calling them that. Emails, receipts, renovation plans, not because I anticipated conflict, but because order made me feel steady. When things are documented, you can think clearly. Margaret preferred conversations. Nothing binding, nothing traceable. Over time, I noticed how decisions happened without me. A landscaper hired because he was already in the area. A roof inspection scheduled because it was overdue. Each thing small enough to accept, each thing framed as help. If you were in my situation, you might have done the same. You tell yourself it's easier to let one thing go than to turn it into a problem. You tell yourself harmony matters. But harmony built on imbalance is fragile. The veranda was the first thing I claimed outright. It wasn't extravagant, just an enclosed extension with light, space, and quiet. I paid for the plans myself. I consulted zoning guidelines. I checked permits. Everything was compliant, clean, proper. Margaret didn't object directly. She asked questions. Is that necessary? Will it affect resale? Have you thought about liability? Always liability. Evan wavered. He didn't oppose me, exactly. He just didn't support me strongly enough to counter her doubt. That was his pattern. Neutrality disguised as fairness. I started work anyway. That decision didn't cause an explosion. It caused something subtler. Margaret grew attentive. She mentioned neighbors more often. She forwarded me an email from the city general information. Nothing specific. She asked whether I'd spoken to the right people. I answered calmly. I showed her the paperwork. She nodded. She didn't argue. I thought that meant acceptance. What it really meant was observation. The years before the demolition weren't dramatic. They were structured, controlled, polite. I was never shouted down. I was simply outmaneuvered in slow motion. Looking back, I see it clearly. Power doesn't always arrive as force. Sometimes it arrives as reassurance. Sometimes it wears the face of family. And sometimes, when you've been quiet long enough, people forget you're paying attention. The thing that set everything in motion wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a threat. It was a comment, small, offhand, almost helpful. I was watering the front plants one afternoon when Linda, a neighbor I barely knew, slowed her walk and nodded toward the veranda. "That's a nice addition," she said. Then, after a pause, "I heard the city's been stricter lately about extensions." That was it. No accusation, no warning, just a sentence dropped into the air and left there. I thanked her and went back inside. Later that evening, I mentioned it to Evan the way you mention weather. Casually. Without weight. His response came too quickly. "My mom said something similar." That caught my attention. "What do you mean?" "She was just wondering if everything was approved," he said. "She worries." Of course she did. The next morning, Margaret called. Her tone was light, conversational. She asked how my day was going before easing into the topic. "I ran into Linda from down the street," she said. "She mentioned some concerns. You know how neighbors talk." I didn't correct her. I asked one question instead. "What concerns?" She hesitated, not because she didn't know, but because she was choosing how much to say. "Just that the city's been cracking down on non-compliant structures. I'd hate for you to get fined." I told her I had permits. I had checked. Everything was in order. "I'm sure you did," she said. "I just thought I should mention it. For your protection." After that, the calls increased. Not frantic, coordinated. An aunt asked whether the extension might affect insurance. A cousin wondered if it could lower property value. None of them sounded hostile. They sounded informed. Pressure doesn't always come from one direction. Sometimes it arrives as consensus. Evan started forwarding me articles, city notices, general advisories. He never told me to stop. He just asked if I was absolutely sure. I was. That certainty seemed to unsettle him more than doubt would have. A week later, Margaret asked for copies of my permits. She framed it as help. If anything ever came up, it's good to have them on file. I sent them. Clean PDFs, clearly dated, approved. She replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing more. For a few days, things went quiet. No calls, no comments, no concern. That should have warned me. Instead, I interpreted silence as resolution. I returned to my routine. Work, early mornings on the veranda, coffee, notes, the steady sound of life functioning. Then Evan mentioned something that didn't belong. "Mom spoke to someone at the city," he said one evening, not looking at me. "Just to ask a few general questions." I put my cup down. Slowly. "About what?" "About safety standards," he said. She didn't give an address. That was the first time I felt it. Not anger, not fear. A quiet recognition. I told him evenly, "She doesn't have the authority to do that. Entity. She's just trying to help," he said. "You know how she is." I did know. And that was the problem. 2 days later, Margaret stopped by unannounced. She stood on the veranda and tapped one of the support beams with her knuckle, like a doctor testing reflexes. "This feels flimsy," she said. "It's reinforced steel," I replied. She smiled. "Sometimes things look stronger than they are." She suggested a professional inspection, one she could arrange quickly. I declined. That was the moment the air changed. She didn't argue. She simply nodded. "All right," she said. "I hope you're right." That night, Evan barely spoke. He moved through the house like someone waiting for instructions that never came. The next morning, I left early for work. Everything looked normal. Too normal. By noon, my phone buzzed. A text from Evan. "There's an issue with the veranda. Call me." I didn't call. I drove. When I turned onto our street, I saw the truck first, then the cones, then the men. By the time I pulled over, Margaret was already there. She wasn't panicked, she wasn't rushed, she was prepared. Later, she would say it was an emergency, that she had no choice, that she acted out of concern. But emergencies don't come with prearranged crews. They come with panic, with confusion, with questions. What unfolded that day was not a reaction. It was a plan activated, and I had been standing inside its path, assuming logic would protect me. After the crew left, the house felt hollow. Not because the veranda was gone, but because the illusion went with it. The sense that we were all operating under the same rules, that conversations meant something, that good faith was mutual. Margaret lingered for a few minutes after the truck pulled away. She spoke to Evan in a low voice near the garage. I stayed where I was, on the edge of what used to be my morning space, looking at exposed framing and dust. She didn't ask how I felt. She told Evan what would happen next. "We'll sort out repairs," she said. "I'll handle it." Handle it. The same word she'd used for years. When she finally left, Evan came toward me with his hands open, like he was approaching a skittish animal. "I didn't know she was going to do that," he said. I believed him. That didn't make it better. I didn't respond right away. I walked inside, washed my hands, and sat at the dining table. I placed my phone face down in front of me. I waited until he sat too. "I'm not discussing how I feel," I said. "I'm discussing what happened." He nodded quickly, relieved. Feelings were messy, facts were manageable. "She said the structure was unsafe," he said. "She said the city could fine us." I lifted my phone and turned it over. I photographed the permit. "It wasn't issued to us." He frowned. "What do you mean?" "It was issued to her," I said, "under a claim of ownership." "It's mujid." The word ownership landed between us and stayed there. "That can't be right," he said. "She wouldn't." "She did," I said. "And I'm not speculating. I'm confirming." That was the moment I stopped trying to persuade him. I could see it in his posture, the instinct to explain, to soften, to mediate. He was already preparing to live in the gray. I wasn't. I spent the next few days quietly stepping out of the family orbit. I requested the full work order from the demolition company. I didn't accuse. I asked for documentation. They sent it within hours. Invoice, authorization form, emergency justification, signature, Margaret's. I contacted the city permitting office. Not with outrage, with questions. What constitutes an emergency demolition? Who is authorized to request one? What happens when ownership is misrepresented? The answers came slowly, but clearly. Misrepresentation invalidated the permit. Liability transferred to the applicant. Fines applied. Insurance coverage became complicated. That word again. Liability. I opened a new folder on my computer, labeled it with the address. Inside, I saved everything. Evan noticed the shift. I stopped updating him. I stopped asking. I stopped reacting when Margaret called. I let everything go to voicemail. "You're shutting us out," he said one evening. "I'm creating distance," I replied. "There's a difference." He didn't argue. He didn't agree either. He stayed in place, hoping stillness would undo momentum. Margaret tried a different approach. She sent a text. "I know today was upsetting. Let's talk and clear the air." I didn't respond. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It's a boundary without explanation. Instead, I contacted a lawyer. A short consultation. I brought documents. I asked specific questions. What are my options? What are my obligations? What do I need to protect myself? The lawyer didn't raise an eyebrow. She didn't dramatize. She said, "You have leverage." Leverage is a clean word. It doesn't imply revenge. It implies balance. I asked her one final question. "If I do nothing, what happens?" She paused. "Then the behavior continues." That was my turning point. Not the demolition. Not the humiliation. The realization that inaction had been interpreted as consent. I didn't confront Margaret. I didn't issue ultimatums. I sent one certified letter. A notice of dispute, factual, documented, requesting reimbursement, acknowledgement of unauthorized action, and confirmation that no further decisions would be made regarding my property without my consent. No emotional language, No accusations, just process. When Margaret received it, she called Evan. He called me. She's very upset, he said. She feels attacked. I didn't attack her, I said. I documented her. That distinction mattered. For the first time in years, the center of gravity shifted, not because I raised my voice, but because I stopped absorbing theirs. I wasn't begging anymore. I wasn't explaining. I was proceeding. And that changed everything. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in envelopes, in emails, in careful, unemotional language that left very little room for interpretation. The demolition company responded first. They sent a full-packet work authorization, payment confirmation, and the emergency justification Margaret had submitted. It was a single-page statement, typed and signed, claiming the veranda posed an immediate risk of collapse and that the homeowner had authorized removal. The homeowner. That word carried weight. Attached was proof of payment. Margaret had used her own account, not ours. That detail mattered. It separated impulse from premeditation. Next came the city's response. The permitting office confirmed in writing that the emergency permit was issued based solely on the applicant's sworn representation of ownership and risk. No inspection had been conducted prior to demolition. No notice had been served to the actual property owners. They used the phrase, material misrepresentation. I read it twice. Material misrepresentation voids protection. It shifts responsibility. It creates exposure. I forwarded the email to my lawyer. She replied with 3 words. This is significant. Up to that point, the family narrative was still intact. Margaret had acted out of concern. She had stepped in to help. Evan repeated those phrases when he spoke to relatives. Not because he was lying, but because he needed them to be true. Facts don't care about that need. I filed a formal complaint with the city. Not dramatic. Procedural. I attached documentation. I requested a review. A week later, a notice was issued. Margaret was cited for unauthorized demolition and misrepresentation. The fine wasn't catastrophic, but it was public record. That was when the tone changed. Margaret called me directly for the first time since receiving the letter. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said. Her voice was steady but tight. We could have handled this privately. I listened. I didn't interrupt. You've embarrassed me, she continued. People are talking. I waited until she finished. This isn't about embarrassment, I said. It's about responsibility. She paused. I could hear her recalibrating. You know I was only trying to protect you, she said. I know what you filed, I replied. I've read it. Silence. I didn't think it would go this far, she said finally. That's not a defense, I said. Calm. Precise. That's an admission. She ended the call shortly after. The family reacted quickly. A meeting was suggested, then insisted upon. Evan's aunt offered to host. The tone was conciliatory, urgent. When I arrived, everyone was already seated. Margaret sat at the head of the table. Old habits die hard. She began speaking before I sat down. We're here to clear up a misunderstanding. I took my seat and placed a folder on the table. Thick. Organized. This isn't a misunderstanding, I said. It's documented. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I opened the folder and slid copies across the table. The permit. The invoice. The city notice. One by one, the room quieted. Margaret reached for the papers, then stopped. She didn't read them. She didn't need to. She knew what they said. Evan looked at me, then at his mother. For the first time, confusion replaced loyalty. You told me it was an emergency, he said. It was a judgment call, she replied. No, I said. It was a false claim. That was the moment her authority collapsed. Not with anger, with clarity. The conversation didn't explode. It deflated. Margaret tried to frame it as overreaction, as bureaucracy gone too far, but the documents stayed on the table, unmoved by her tone. Someone asked, quietly, "Why didn't you tell them?" Margaret didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. I stood. "I'm not here to punish anyone," I said. "I'm here to correct the record." I gathered my folder and left. By the end of the week, the demolition company issued a revised statement acknowledging unauthorized instruction. The city finalized the citation. Margaret's version of events no longer held. False power depends on silence. Once the silence breaks, it doesn't recover. Once the facts were established, everyone wanted calm. That was the word they used, calm. As if calm were a destination we could all return to, provided I agreed to stop moving forward. Evan was the first to try. "We've made the point," he said one evening, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "The city's involved. She's been fined. Isn't that enough?" I didn't answer right away. I finished reading the email on my screen and closed my laptop. "No," I said. He exhaled slowly. "What else do you want?" The question assumed something important, that this was about desire, about satisfaction. "It's not about what I want," I said. "It's about what won't happen again." Margaret tried next, through intermediaries. A cousin called to suggest a family agreement. An aunt proposed mediation. Everyone emphasized unity. No one mentioned accountability. They framed it as forgiveness, as moving on. I framed it as closure. I sent one response, the same response to everyone. I would not withdraw the complaint. I would not accept informal apologies. I required written acknowledgement of unauthorized action, reimbursement for the demolition, and a formal boundary agreement regarding future involvement with my property. Nothing more, nothing less. The word boundary unsettled them. Margaret finally requested a meeting. Just the two of us. We met in a quiet cafe, neutral territory. She arrived early. I arrived on time. She started with regret, not for the act, but for the outcome. "I never imagined it would turn into this," she said. "I was trying to help." "I understand that's how you see it," I replied. "It's not how the law sees it." Her mouth tightened. "Must everything be legal?" "When it involves ownership and demolition," I said. "Yes." She leaned forward. "You're tearing this family apart." I didn't raise my voice. "I didn't demolish anything," I said. "You did." That was the moment she realized compromise wasn't coming. She tried one last approach. "What if I pay for the repairs and we forget the rest?" I shook my head. Repairs address damage. They don't address authority. The meeting ended without resolution. Evan struggled with my refusal. He wanted balance. He wanted everyone to feel heard. "I feel like you're choosing this over us," he said. I met his eyes. "I'm choosing clarity," I said. "You're free to choose something else." That was the hardest boundary. Not with Margaret. With him. Eventually, Margaret's lawyer contacted mine. The tone shifted again, formal, careful. A settlement was reached. Reimbursement, written acknowledgement, a legally binding agreement restricting her involvement in decisions related to the property. It wasn't punitive. It was precise. The family didn't celebrate. They didn't condemn me either. They adjusted. Power had changed shape, and they could feel it. Calm returned, but not the kind they wanted. It was a different calm, one built on limits, not appeasement. And for the first time, those limits were visible. The agreement was signed on a Thursday. 2 pages. Clean language, no emotional clauses, just definitions, restrictions, and acknowledgement. When I scanned the final copy and saved it to my folder, I felt something settle, not relief, exactly. Completion. Evan watched me from the doorway. "So that's it?" he asked. "For this issue," I said. "Yes." He nodded, but his expression didn't match the word. He had expected the document to fix more than it could. The house felt different after that, not hostile, just clarified. Every interaction carried a quiet awareness of what had been named. Margaret didn't come by anymore. She didn't call either. When she did appear at family gatherings, she kept her distance, polite, reserved, stripped of initiative. That should have felt like a victory. It didn't. Because power dynamics don't disappear. They relocate. Evan tried to resume normalcy. He cooked dinner. He asked about my day. He avoided mentioning his mother, as if omission could rewrite the past. One evening, as we ate in silence, he said, "I just want things to go back to how they were." I set my fork down. They can't, I said. And they shouldn't. He looked at me genuinely confused. Why not? We're fine now. We're functional, I said. That's not the same thing. The truth was, I had changed in a way he hadn't anticipated. I no longer filled gaps. I no longer softened edges. I no longer accepted neutrality where alignment was required. He noticed it in small ways. I stopped asking for approval. I made decisions and informed him after. I spent more time away from the house, rebuilding my routines elsewhere. You're pulling away, he said one night. I'm standing where I can breathe, I replied. The decision to leave wasn't dramatic. There was no argument that triggered it, just accumulation. I rented a small apartment across town. Temporary, I told myself, practical. I packed what I needed: clothes, files, the folder. When I told Evan, he didn't stop me. He asked if it was permanent. I don't know, I said. And I meant it. Margaret called the day I moved out. Her voice was different. Quieter. Less assured. I never wanted you to leave, she said. I know, I replied. You wanted control. She didn't deny it. If I apologize, she asked, would that change anything? I considered the question. Not emotionally, logically. No, I said. Apologies don't reverse patterns. She sighed. I didn't think you'd go this far. I paused. I didn't either. We ended the call without bitterness, without closure too. But some stories don't need final lines. When I closed the door to the apartment that first night, the silence felt unfamiliar, honest, unmanaged. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't angry. I was unencumbered. Consequences don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they settle in, quiet and persistent, reshaping routines until the old way of living no longer fits. Margaret's did. The citation from the city stayed on record. It wasn't headline-worthy, but it followed her. When she tried to intervene in other family matters, offering to handle things, people hesitated. They asked for details. They asked for paperwork. Her authority had been procedural for years. Once the procedures failed her, so did the confidence of others. The demolition company stopped taking her calls. She noticed that more than the fine. At a neighborhood association meeting, someone mentioned the incident casually, not accusing, just factual. Margaret smiled through it, but she stopped attending after that. Visibility had become uncomfortable. Evan felt the consequences differently. Without his mother's presence, he had to occupy space he'd never fully claimed. Decisions waited on him now. Silence no longer defaulted to someone else's voice. He struggled with that. We spoke occasionally. Short conversations, logistics, neutral ground. He told me work was busy. I told him the apartment was quiet. Once, he said, I didn't realize how much she managed. I did, I replied. That wasn't an accusation, just an observation. As for the house, it remained standing, unchanged. The veranda wasn't rebuilt right away. Insurance processes took time, so did my interest. Margaret paid what she was required to pay, on time, without comment. That, more than any apology, marked her acceptance. The family adjusted. Gatherings grew smaller, conversations shifted, the unspoken hierarchy flattened. No one took her lead automatically anymore, she noticed. Power, once exposed, rarely regains its former shape. My karma was quieter. The apartment became home faster than I expected. I set up a small workspace by the window. No veranda, no oversight, just light and order. I slept better. The tension I'd mistaken for responsibility dissolved. In its place came something steadier, self-trust. I ran into Margaret once at a grocery store. She nodded. I nodded back. No words exchanged. No need. She looked smaller, not diminished, just human. That was the outcome I hadn't anticipated. Not revenge, not dominance, reduction. The situation resolved itself the way it had to, through record, through process, through limits. Nothing dramatic followed, no further confrontations, no attempts at reconciliation, just a realignment. And that, I learned, is what karma often looks like when you don't interfere with it. My life didn't reset after everything ended. It recalibrated. There was no moment where I woke up feeling victorious. No surge of relief that erased what had happened. Instead, there was continuity days stacking neatly again, no longer bent around someone else's expectations. The apartment became permanent without a decision ever being announced. I bought a second chair for the kitchen, hung art I liked without explaining it, let the space reflect me without considering whether it would be approved, questioned, or quietly overridden. That absence of anticipation changed everything. Evan and I finalized our separation in a way that mirrored the rest of the process. Calm, documented, respectful, no accusations, no dramatic last conversation. When we signed the papers, he looked at me and said, "I didn't know how to protect both of you." I nodded. "I know." That was as close as we came to summary. We spoke once more afterward, weeks later. He asked how I was doing. "I'm steady," I said. And I meant it. Work expanded. Slowly, then with intention. I rebuilt the studio idea not as a structure attached to someone else's property, but as a room I rented, shaped, and controlled. Clients didn't know the story behind it. They didn't need to. Strength doesn't require an audience. One afternoon, months later, I returned to the old neighborhood for an errand. The street looked the same. Trees taller, paint fresher on some houses, familiar but distant. The veranda was still gone. I stood across the street for a moment and observed the house as if it belonged to someone else. There was no ache, no pull, just memory, neatly filed. Margaret's car was in the driveway. She came out while I was there. Slower now. Careful. When she saw me, she paused. For a second, I wondered if she would speak. She didn't. She nodded once. Acknowledgement without claim. I nodded back and walked away. That was our final exchange. Not reconciliation, not hostility, recognition. Later that evening, I thought about the way the story might sound if told differently, louder, more dramatic, with sharper edges and clearer villains. But that wouldn't have been true. What actually changed my life wasn't confrontation. It was clarity. The moment I stopped negotiating my boundaries as if they were preferences, I learned something precise from the whole experience. People who rely on access panic when access is restricted. People who rely on silence collapse when documentation appears. And people who mistake patience for permission are always surprised by consequences. I don't regret staying quiet for as long as I did. It taught me observation. It taught me restraint. But I don't confuse silence with virtue anymore. My relationships now are smaller, cleaner, mutual. When someone offers help, it doesn't come with conditions. When I say no, it's accepted without explanation. That's the life I rebuilt. Not larger, just truer. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you already know it wasn't about a veranda. It was about ownership, of space, of voice, of self. And once that's reclaimed, nothing else needs to be taken. If this story resonated with you, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you're listening from somewhere right now, leave a comment with your city. I read them all.